Hey, beer appreciators, สวัสดีครับ Welcome to Beer Time Story, the platform where beer and brewing knowledge is shared. Or welcome back to some of you. Okay, for today's session, we will talk about hops again, but this time it'll be from, other perspectives. This time, we will look into the context of bitterness, and we will have a good burp about the vague relationship between IBU, International Bitterness Unit, and perceived bitterness topic. Speaking of bitterness, it is a taste which is derived from hops that's kind of, has a strong bond with the flavor of beer. And you may have experienced it by yourself, or you may have heard, a sentence like, I don't like beer. It tastes bitter. Whether you like it or not, it is undeniable that, the bitter taste in beer surrounds flavor of most styles of beers. In some past eras, you can even witness kind of an arm race in bitterness, or even the spread of the habit of looking at the IBU number at the bar, the craft beer bar that you want to order the beer, in the craft beer world, which seems to, fade out in this present day. However, this IBU is still relevant in the backstage of beer world, the brewing part to be specific. It is involved, in almost every process, every part of the beer brewing itself, from raw material selection to sensory evaluation and quality control. It is part of the beer specification that the brewery is supposed to have their eyes on. And, sorry if I forgot to mention that the IBU is a unit that represents the bitterness in beer. And it is understood that the higher the value, the number, the more the beer is expected to be. Now, one interesting thing about IBU is that the number actually doesn't tell it all. It isn't that straightforward. You can have beers that have exactly the same IBU value, but have completely different perceived bitterness. Or in another example, you can have a higher IBU beer that perceivably tastes less bitter than the lower IBU one. Interesting, right? Or some of you may have experienced this kind of event or phenomena, right? You may taste the beer and you may think like, it tastes less bitter than what the number, the IBU says on the bottle of the can or, the beer board. Interesting, right? And this kind of vague relationship is what we hope to find out with the guidance of our guest speaker in this session, who has spent about 30 years of his life in the academic side of hops. So I believe that he is one of the top candidates to walk us through today's session. And here is a bit of his background. In 1994, during his last PhD year as an organic chemistry student at Purdue University in Indiana, USA, he set foot as a hop chemist at Pfizer Brewing Ingredients Division. Later, that division was purchased by John I. Haas, one of the world's leading hop suppliers based in Northern America. And, he spent his time working there for about a good 8 years before moving to Hofsteiner, which is another well-known hop supplier in the US. There, he continued his work in the world of hops for about 15 years, and his latest position at Hofsteiner was a technical director. And in 2023, he stepped down from the company and became a consultant. During his time at both John I. Haas and Hofsteiner, he is credited with publishing several papers related to hop analysis, the discovery of new hop compounds, hop bittering compounds, dry hopping, and many more studies that, led to a lot of aha moment for many brewers. And on top of that, he's also recognized as a developer of standards to accurately measure various hop compounds in hop products and beer. And also, on top of that, he is a founding member of the International Hop Standards Committee. So please welcome our guest speaker, Dr. John Paul May.
Hi.
Hi, how you doing?
Good, good.
Thanks for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you on our platform.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
So you are live from Virginia, right?
Right. Yep.
And that is the hop field at your backyard?
No, this is a picture of a hop field in Yakima, Washington. So, yeah, Washington State grows about 80% of the U.S. hop crop. About 10% is in Idaho, another 10% in Oregon, and the United States grows almost half of the world's hops, about 48% of the world's hops.
Yeah, that's
and Germany grows like 45%. So it's basically the two countries grow almost all the world's hops. Yeah.
Yeah. And if I get this right, during this time in the US, I mean, the Northern Hemisphere is the growing time for hops, right? And
right.
Probably they are reaching its peak, waiting for the harvest, probably at the end of the month.
Yeah. Harvest will start usually like the last week of August. And generally, it's the aroma varieties like Cascade that get harvested first. Mm-hmm. And then as you go through the month of September, it's more of the higher alpha varieties that start getting harvested. And harvest will last generally through the whole month of September. Once in a while, it'll go into October, but generally it's done by the end of September. So it's a very short harvest season. Yeah.
Got you. And yeah, so there's one thing I'm curious. I mean, in terms of your daily role at the moment as a consultant, can you share with us about it? You know, like what do you actually do? Is it still related to the field of hops or some other aspect?
Yeah, it's still in the field of hops. I'm working with a couple of companies that make specialty hop products, and so I'm helping them improve the quality, improve their process, looking for ways to make their production a little bit more efficient, and then also helping them with research ideas for doing maybe new products and new applications.
Sounds fun.
Yeah.
Because this, I would say, recent years, right? Probably start from 2020. We start seeing more of these advanced hop products from various hop suppliers, flowable oil, distilled oil, aroma, and it's kind of give brewers more paint, in that toolbox to play around.
Right, exactly. Yeah, a lot of those products have been around for really quite some time, but they've been primarily used by the very large breweries. But a lot of the craft brewers are starting to notice these specialty hop products, and they're finding that they could, be very beneficial to improving the quality of their beer.
Right. Gotcha. And Dr. John, before we dive into today's topic, I would like to ask you a bit about the passion that you have for beer, because I understand that you homebrewed during your college time, right? I mean,
right.
I'll start. And do you still homebrew,
Yeah, I still homebrew today. In fact, I just kegged a Hefeweizen a couple days ago. So I generally, once I start drinking a beer, I'll start a week or two later brewing another one. So I have everything in like a 5-gallon Cornelius keg. And so it works out nice. Yeah.
Right. And how did it all start? Your journey in the homebrew, where do you recall that moment?
Yeah, I can't recall why I started doing it. I know I had a friend in college who, maybe he suggested it. I don't recall, but I think part of it too was when I would drive home. So I was going to college in Boston at Northeastern University. And when I would drive home to Connecticut, there was this liquor store called Yankee Spirits in Sturbridge, Massachusetts. Anyways, they had like hundreds and hundreds of different beers from around the world. So I'd always pick up like a 6-pack of 6 different beers. And I guess that's how I started getting interested in beer and then brewing. So, yeah.
And I think the beer scene at the New England at that time is going to be pretty much colorful, I would say.
Sam Adams was really the only, like, let's say, craft brewer, and actually in those days they called it microbrewery.
Yeah.
But it's changed because as the volume of beer increases, it's not micro anymore, and
Yeah.
so they call it craft now. So
Yeah. But it's cool. That's good
yeah,
story, and it's good to know that you are still homebrew nowadays.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay, cool. All right. I think we cut to the topic now, and I know that the main theme here we're going to talk about the International Bitterness Unit (IBU) and the perceived bitterness. But before that, Dr. John Paul, can you please give us like a quick overview of hop? In terms of its component that most of us care about, that contributes to the aroma and flavor.
Right. A lot of people don't maybe know this or appreciate it, but when beer was first being brewed, literally hundreds, if not thousands of years ago, using spices in that process of making beer was very common. And eventually, some of the German brewers started experimenting with hops as a spice. And one of the things they found was that when they used hops, the beer didn't go sour. Bacteria is a very common, infection in all types of fermentation. And so when they used hops, they found out that the beer didn't get sour. And so it started to become the main ingredient, because I know some people are making sour beers today, but back then it was considered, a flaw in the process. And so hops eliminated that. And so it's really, I think, underappreciated, the antibacterial properties that hops have. In fact, I did a significant amount of research on this many years ago. And again, what we found was like about 6 parts per million of isoalpha acid is enough to inhibit gram-positive bacteria like lactobacillus, which is a common, bacteria that can infect your fermentation. Interestingly, alpha acids are even more antimicrobial. They can inhibit bacteria at 2 parts per million. And beta acids are extremely antimicrobial. They can inhibit bacteria at a 0.5 part per million. But as hops became more and more commonly used in brewing, people started to, let's say, not really think about their antibacterial properties, and they started to focus more on the bitterness as well as the aroma. And it is quite interesting, brewing beer with lots of different hop varieties is, you do get a significant difference in, let's say, the clean bitterness versus some other hops that can give more of a harsh or lingering bitterness. And then, of course, the essential oils in hops are primarily responsible, I would say, as the starting material for aroma, because a lot of people don't appreciate that a lot of those essential oils get biotransformed by the yeast during fermentation. I've always been a big fan of making sure the hops go in the hot side before fermentation. Now, I know dry hopping is really popular, and it has a place for contributing aroma as well. But I think you get better aroma if you have the essential oils go through the fermentation process.
Right. And for the hop itself, like those flavor compounds and aroma compounds are mainly concentrated in the specific part called lupulin gland, right?
That's correct. Yeah. The lupulin gland contains the hop organic acids like alpha acid and beta acid, as well as the essential oils.
And those, if you happen to have your hands on, the actual hop cone itself, and you break it down, you're going to see that yellow gland right at the center of the hop stem or the stick, and that gland is the rich oil that we all after.
Right. Yeah.
All right, got it. So in this lupulin gland, correct me if I'm wrong, those bitter acid that you mentioned that has these antimicrobial properties is also packed and compressed in this gland, right?
Yes.
All right, cool. Just to make sure that our listener has a clear understanding of where these compounds are located. So now we kind of know about the hop compounds, the hop structures. And I think it's time we're going to talk about the word IBU, International Bitterness Unit. Dr. John Paul, do you happen to kind of have the story to be shared about its origin? How does it come to be, the definition? Can you walk us through?
Yeah, I believe it was in the 1960s that the U.S. Was developing a method for measuring bitterness in beer, and the Europeans were working on another method, and eventually they combined both methods to have a uniform method, and so that's the International Bitterness Unit test. It's a very simple test. You take like 6 milliliters of beer, and then another 6 milliliters of isooctane. You add a little acid to it, and then you put it in a shaker and you shake it. And then after shaking for a few minutes, you stop shaking, and then you get a phase separation. And the isoalpha acids that's in the beer will get extracted into the isooctane layer. And then you take that isooctane, you put it in a cuvette. It then goes into a spectrophotometer, and then light passes through it. And they measure the absorption at 275 nanometers. And then they multiply that by a factor of a number 50. And then that tells you essentially how many parts per million of isoalpha acid is in the beer. And for the most part, the IBU test is quite accurate if the IBUs are more than 5 and less than 35. Okay. As you go above 35 IBUs, then it starts to skew. It's not as linear as if it is between 5 and 35. So, and the other thing that's important to note is that the IBU test is primarily used on beers in which the hops, or I should say the test was developed primarily for beers that the hops are added on the hot side. So that would be either the brew kettle or the whirlpool. I think some of the disconnect that we're starting to see today is trying to use the IBU test on dry hop beers. And once you start trying to use the IBU on dry hop beers, well, the test really wasn't developed for dry hop beers. And we can talk about that a little bit later if you like.
Right, sure. That would be the vague part for this conversation. So it seems like from what you have shared with us, the IBU was developed with the idea of to be able to find a way to quantify the bitterness in the beer. And they do that by translate the amount of isoalpha acids in the beer. And so 1 IBU will mean like 1 part per million of isoalpha acid in the beer, right?
Right. Yeah. And so, to give you an example, I mean, there was a time when I was younger and my taste buds were very good and I could drink a beer and tell the brewer how many IBUs was in the beer. And I was usually pretty close to being on the nose for that. But like I said, and that's where the IBU test generally, like I said, and the perceived bitterness, they generally line up when the hops are added on the hot side. Mm-hmm. It starts to skew significantly once you start dry hopping.
Right. But if I get this right, the isoalpha acid is not naturally contained in the hops. It has to be put through certain process during the brewing part, right? To make it, to kind of develop this compound that related to the perceived bitterness.
Correct. So when alpha acids are boiled in the brew kettle, they undergo a ring contraction to form a new molecule called isoalpha acid. And the isoalpha acid is the actual bittering compound in beer, and it's also very antimicrobial. And so if you're drinking a beer which the hops have been added in the kettle, typically the only thing that's in the beer is the isoalpha acids. Interestingly, alpha acids are soluble in beer at even very high concentrations. But the reason you generally don't have any alpha acids in a beer where the hops have been added on the hot side is because the alpha acids are also quite nonpolar and they generally absorb onto the yeast. And so they generally don't make it through fermentation. Most beers that are kettle hopped, you'll maybe see 1 or 2 parts per million of alpha acids in the beer, but in most cases you'll see almost none. And only about half of the alpha acids actually do isomerize to form isoalpha acids, and about 30% of that gets into the final beer. So about 1/3 or so of the alpha or the isoalpha acids gets absorbed onto the yeast and doesn't make it into the final beer. So a lot of times what people will do is they'll use like a factor of 0.3. So you look at how much alpha is you're adding in the brew kettle, you multiply that by 0.3, and that kind of tells you how much of the iso will probably end up in the final beer. So those are that 0.3 is the utilization factor that a lot of people use. If you're doing whirlpool hopping, some people will use a factor of like 0.1. So maybe you'll get 10% of the alpha isomerizing in the whirlpool. So,
Got it. And if I get this right, the IBU test, the measurement, is originally developed for the lower IBU camp beer. It seems like it is developed for, the American light lager. Am I getting this right?
well, it would also work with ales, assuming that the hops are added only on the hot side. And even if you did some dry hopping, and again, this is an issue that people sometimes correctly or incorrectly talk about. But if you're adding only a very small amount of hops as dry hopping, generally that won't affect the IBU that much. And when I say a small amount, you're probably looking at maybe a half a pound of hops per barrel or less. That won't generally have a material effect on the IBU. But once you start adding like 1 pound or more, then it will affect the IBU.
Yeah, and we will see, this kind of effect at the end of the session too, through your works, right?
Right.
Right. And at this stage, can we just simply put and say that the higher the IBU number, the higher perceived bitterness we can expect?
Yes.
All right. Okay, so you previously, walk us briefly through how the measurement of this bitterness in beer is developed. And you mentioned the word UV light spectrophotometric assay, right?
Right.
I believe that there is also another way of measuring bitterness in beer, and that is HPLC.
Right. So HPLC is an instrument that has a special column. And so when you inject your beer into that column, it'll separate out the various hop acids based on their polarity. So like for isoalpha acid, it has 3 homologs, right? Co, N, and Ad. Okay.
Yes.
So it can separate those 3. But if your beer contains other hop acids, it can measure that as well. One of the primary reasons HPLC started to be used is when people or hop companies started making these light, stable hop acids. So like there's a sodium borohydride reduced hop acid called Rho isoalpha acid. There's also a hydrogen and palladium reduced isoalpha acid called tetrahydro isoalpha acids. So a lot of brewers were, making beer that contained like Rho, iso, tetra, and there's also a hexa isoalpha acid. And so you couldn't measure these hop acids by the IBU method because it just measures absorption at 275 nanometers. Whereas with HPLC, it could separate the Rho from the iso, from the tetra, and from the hexa. And using HPLC calibration standards, you can measure the peak or the area of those various hop compounds. And by using a standard, you can then determine what the concentration of those hop compounds are. And then what you can do is put together a fairly simple test or formula, I should say. And the formula would be like the perceived bitterness is equal to the parts per million of isoalpha acid plus the parts per million of, let's say, tetrahydroisoalpha acid plus the parts per million of rho isoalpha acid. But you would multiply the parts per million of rho isoalpha acid by a factor of 0.7 because rho is only about 70% as bitter as isoalpha acid. All right. And if there was any hex in there, you could just add the parts per million of the hexahydroisoalpha acid. I should probably point out a lot of the old literature on the perceived bitterness of tetra will report it as being 1.6 times more bitter than isoalpha acid. But it's been found that that's not actually correct. It is correct if you're comparing iso and tetra in water. The tetra is a lot more bitter in water, but because water has a higher pH than beer, if you did a comparison of tetra in beer versus iso, you'd find out that the bitterness intensity of the two are quite similar. So that's why, So you could use HPLC to measure different hop compounds in your beer and then do this simple calculated bitterness, and that'll tell you what the perceived bitterness would be, and it would be like similar to like the IBU bitterness.
Got it. So to me, it seems like the HPLC method, I'm not really sure in terms of the way the technology, between the spectrophotometric and HPLC is developed. Which one is older, which one is much more recent, but it seems like the UV light spectrophotometric way is the first kind of measurement that the researcher used to measure hop bitterness in beer. And later on, the HPLC comes with a much more advanced ways to magnifying other compounds, and it can be used to display a better picture of the perceived bitterness. Sounds about right?
Yeah. In fact, when I first started working in the hop industry in 1993, HPLC was very, very new. And the HPLCs that were made back then are nothing like the ones that are being used today. To give you an idea, we couldn't inject beer into the HPLC to measure the hop acids. We had to actually concentrate the beer in order to get it high enough so that the detectors, which weren't very good in those days, could then measure, the hop acids in the beer. So, but like I said, today the detectors are so sensitive, you can literally just inject the beer straight into the machine and measure the hop acids that way.
Right. Wow, that's fascinating, how technologies evolve. And Dr. John Paul, for the UV light spectrophotometric assays, from what I understand is that you have to put the beer sample, you have to mix them with isooctane, which is the solution that will absorb the isoalpha acid, right? And you just use that layer to analyze the wavelength.
Correct. Yep.
And the absorption at 275 nanometer wavelength is the one that represents the isoalpha acid, which is the main working principle of this UV light spectrophotometer, right?
Right. Correct.
And for the HPLC, it's more kind of you push the sample through series of separation column, followed by the detector, and each compound's gonna have different responses, right?
Yeah, it's gonna, because the column separates the compounds based on their polarity, they'll elute or leave the column at different times. And so we know, for example, that let's say for an example, let's say isoalpha acid, we know comes off at around 6 minutes. All right. Okay. Then we'd know like tetra comes off at like say 7 minutes. Because rho is more polar, it might come off at like 5 minutes. And so we know, based on the retention time, which compounds are what. Plus we have the standards, which will then also come off at those correct times that we can use. Now, one of the things maybe we should get into next is this, the dry hopping. Right. So one of the things we do, in our labs is we get beer samples in all the time from breweries. And some of the standard testing we would do is IBU as well as HPLC. Well, when we started doing HPLC on these dry hop beers, we started noticing that there were like high concentrations of humulinones
Mhm.
and even some fairly high concentrations of alpha acids in the beer. Now, for those who don't know, humulinones are generally referred to as oxidized alpha acids. But if you look at their molecular structure, they really look like isoalpha acids, okay, except they have an extra hydroxy group. And because they have that extra hydroxy group, it makes the humulinone more beer soluble. It's a lot more soluble than isoalpha acids. And so when we were seeing, these dry hop beers containing as much as 15 and 20 and even up to 30 parts per million of humulinones, I was talking to the chemist in the lab and I said, there's something going on here. Because I go, if you measure the amount of humulinones in hops, it's small. It's like 0.2%, 0.3%, versus, having as much as, 10 or 15% alpha acids, right?
Yeah.
And so, I'm like, if 100% of it gets into the beer, I go, that could explain these high concentrations. So we ended up doing a series of dry hopping experiments, and that's exactly what we found, is that the humulinones at like even just 1 pound per barrel dose rate for dry hopping, 98% got into the beer.
Wow.
And at 2 pounds per barrel, it was like, 92 or 95%. So, these compounds are extremely soluble. And so, and then humulinones are also reported to be about 2/3 as bitter as isoalpha acids.
Mhm.
And then we also saw alpha acids in the beer. And again, in some cases, we could see fairly high levels, as much as 10 to 15 parts per million in the beer. And now here's the thing. The alpha acids, they only are about 1/10 as bitter as isoalpha acids. So, right.
And that is kind of the vague part of this theme because, like what we know, initially IBU kind of represents the beer that uses mainly the kettle hop addition. But here comes the hoppy beer that we all love about, right? The IPA or the development of New England IPA, heavy whirlpool hop, heavy load of dry hops, and that kind of changes the way the solubility of each hop compounds in the beer, and it also introduces a different kind of perceived bitterness on hop compounds into the final beer too, right?
Correct.
And the use of UV light spectrophotometric method kind of cannot explain this thing. You have to use the HPLC, right?
Exactly.
Okay, so can you help, point out the, reason why the UV light spectro doesn't work for, the dry hop beer?
Right. So one of the other things we found when we started doing these dry hopping experiments was if you're dry hopping with like 1 pound of hops per barrel or higher, if you are dry hopping a very bitter beer, so something like around 35 ppm of ISO, and you dry hop that, what we found is that the leaf material from the hops would absorb and actually remove some of the isoalpha acids from the beer. Okay. So brewers who were brewing, let's say a 35 IBU beer, when they would dry hop, the beer would taste sometimes less bitter.
Mhm.
But when they measured the IBUs of the beer, the IBUs went up and they didn't know what was going on. And so this is where the HPLC comes into play. We
Right.
were able to show that, the beer started with 35 ppm of isoalpha acids, but when we added a pound of hops per barrel, the ISO concentration dropped to about 25 parts per million.
Mhm.
So we lost 10 ppm of bitterness, but then we may have only added, let's say 10 ppm of humulinone, which is, 0.6 times as bitter. So the 10 ppm of humulinone added maybe 6. And then if we had like 5 ppm of alpha, well, that's only 0.5
Yeah.
in bitterness. So now we went from 35 to like 30. Okay. But if you start adding the ppm of humulinone and alpha on top of the ISO, then all of a sudden the IBUs were going up, but the perceived bitterness was going down. And so this was a big disconnect with brewers, because you expect, as we talked about earlier, if the IBUs go up, the beer should become more bitter.
Yeah.
But what they were finding is, yeah, the IBUs were going up, but the beer tastes less bitter. And that also happens when you go up to 2 pounds per barrel. Okay. The bitterness starts to continue to go down, but the IBUs continue to go up because now you're adding more humulinone and you're adding more alpha acid. And that was the thing, another thing that we pointed out. And yeah, and it's here on this slide with all these crazy compounds and wavelengths.
Yeah.
But what we found was that the alpha acids and humulinones absorb about 80% as much as isoalpha acids. Okay. And beta acids, if you have them in your beer, and generally you only see beta acids in like hazy IPAs, but beta only absorbs about 60% as much as isoalpha acids.
So if we solely rely on the UV light spectrum alone, the 275 nanometer wavelength, response, in general, people are going to think that it represents purely isoalpha acid. But in reality, there are also other compounds like, we've been talking like in this past 5-10 minutes, the alpha acid, the oxidized alpha acid, the beta acid that also show the response at this wavelength too, right?
Yeah. So when you do that isooctane extraction of your beer, you're not just extracting isoalpha acids, but you're also extracting alpha acids and humulinones.
Right.
And if there's beta acids in your beer, it'll extract that as well. And see, and that's what we did, is we would take that isooctane layer, okay, and we would not only put it in the UV spectro, but we can inject it on the HPLC. And then the HPLC will separate out the compounds. And that's how we were able to say, hey, guess what? This beer, all right, contains humulinones, isoalpha acids, and alpha acids. And then because, again, we have the standards, we can measure the exact concentration of those. And then, like I said, then we can plug those concentrations into our simple formula, calculated bitterness, and get a number that's more similar to the perceived bitterness.
Yeah, to me, this is one of the biggest, aha moments in terms of the discovery of this research that's like translate to how the beer actually tastes in the real world, in the practical world. And to be able to view this kind of how the picture becomes much more clearer, the HPLC data shows, variety of hop bittering compounds. And with the standard that you guys have, the development of the way you can calculate the perceived bitterness become much more precise.
Yeah, and you're exactly right. It was an aha moment because I gave a talk in 2015, and when I went through, I didn't have all the data that we're going to talk about today, but I had a lot of it. And as soon as I was done with the talk, I can't tell you how many craft brewers came up to me and they said, "You finally explained the mystery." We were dry hopping, the IBUs were going up, the beer was tasting less bitter, and we didn't know what the hell was going on. And they go, and now we do. And I was just like, wow. So I didn't realize it was a mystery until they brought it to my attention. And then it forced us to start really digging into this in a lot more detail.
Right. So this is kind of the summary of what you've already mentioned like previously. The table here is just to display the main hop bittering compounds, and it also shows the bitterness in terms of the reference to the isoalpha acid. So the oxidized one, the humulinone, is about 66% as bitter as isoalpha acid. And the alpha acid itself is like about 10% as bitter as isoalpha acid. Now, this is just of my curiosity, like this 66 and 10% bitterness as a reference to isoalpha acid. Does it come from the sensory analysis or from the other way of measurement?
Yeah, it comes from sensory. There's a researcher out of Oregon State University, Paul Shellhammer, who gave a talk on the bitterness intensity of humulinones. and he reported it was 2/3 as bitter, so 66% as bitter.
Right.
We also took some unhopped beer and we added something like 20 ppm of humulinones. We made humulinones in the lab, and so we added 20 ppm, which means it should be about 12 or so IBUs and in bitterness. And then we took another bottle of unhopped beer and we added 12 ppm of isoalpha acids. And when we tasted the two, they had the same bitterness intensity. The one thing I should note, though, is that the Humulinone beer actually had a nice, smooth, non-lingering bitterness, whereas the ISO had more of a lingering bitterness. And I talked about the Rho isoalpha acid. The Rho isoalpha acid is about 70% as bitter as isoalpha acid, and it also has a smooth, non-lingering bitterness. And interestingly, we did take some of the bottle of unhopped beer and we added a 20 ppm of the Rho isoalpha acid to the beer. And when we compared the bitterness intensity to the Humulinones, the profile and the intensity was very, very similar. It was almost indistinguishable. So that was kind of a neat side project that we did. But yeah, that comes from sensory analysis. Yeah, those numbers.
Interesting. And do we naturally find the oxidized alpha acid or humulinones in the hop cones, like the pellets?
Yes.
Is it like, okay.
Yeah. In fact, kind of an interesting note is we kind of discovered the humulinones in hops when we started pelletizing hops. And it wasn't that long ago, probably about maybe 20 years ago, actually. We were analyzing some baled hops, so the leaf hop, all right? And we were measuring it by HPLC. And then we pelletized the hops, okay? And it just so happened that it was over the weekend, so the pellets didn't get analyzed for a couple of days later. And the analytical chemist in the lab noticed that these little peaks in the HPLC got bigger in the pellet. And we then started a little study, and what we ended up finding is, the baled hop might only have like 0.05% humulinone, okay? But then once it was pelletized, it would increase over time. It only took about 10 days to maximize out to maybe 0.2 or 0.3% humulinones. And so, again, when the alpha acid is in the lupulin gland, okay, and your hops are baled, you only break maybe 10 or 15% of the lupulin gland. And so that's why you have this small amount of humulinone in the bale. There's something in the leaf material which causes that alpha acid to oxidize to form humulinones. But when you pelletize hops, you're breaking 100% of the lupulin gland. So now all of the alpha acid is exposed to the leaf material. And again, we don't know what it is exactly, but there's something there that causes the alpha acid to then oxidize to form the humulinone. And so we get that increase when we pelletize.
Well, that is a kind of wild discovery, just a few days apart and it developed.
Yeah. In fact, the other thing that was kind of interesting is we did a study where we looked at that increase after pelleting over time at room temperature as well as at refrigerated temperature.
Okay.
And interestingly, yes, the refrigerated temperature took longer, but they both ended up at the same concentration after, like I said, a couple of weeks refrigerated versus a few days at room temperature. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with HSI,
that's
hop
what I was.
storage index, right?
Yeah.
The other thing we found is hops that have a higher concentration or have a higher HSI will also have a higher concentration of the humulinones. Okay. The one thing though that was kind of interesting is you could have two different hop varieties with the same HSI, but they generally would have different concentration of humulinones. So unfortunately, you can't use the HSI number to predict what your humulinone concentration is, but as a general rule, the higher the HSI, in that variety, the higher the humulonone concentration.
Gotcha. And from the HPLC data that we analyzed the beering compounds in beer, the three main one is going to be plugged in this equation shown in this photo. And we should be able to get the estimated calculated sensory bitterness that is a better representative of how the perceived bitterness is for that particular beer.
Exactly.
Got it. So I think it is time to talk about the two main researches that you published. It is about the effect of dry hopping on the beer, how it changes the bittering compounds profile and the bitterness in the beer itself. I'm going to pull a last photo up and probably, let you walk us through it.
Yeah, so this first slide, the hop acid concentration versus pounds per barrel, I really like this slide because it does a nice job at showing what happens in your beer when you start to dry hop.
Yeah.
So as you can see here, the red line is the isoalpha acid. And again, so what we did here is we brewed a 42 IBU beer. Okay. So I had 40, and these are HPLC numbers. So 42 parts per million of isoalpha acid. And as you can see here, when we added 1 pound per barrel, all right, the ISO concentration dropped to 30 parts per million. So think about that. We lost 12 ppm of isoalpha acids when we added just 1 pound of hops. Okay.
Yeah.
And these were hop pellets, right?
Yes.
And then you can see that there's an increase in the humulonone as well as the alpha acid in that beer, right? So the beer started off with about 5 ppm humulonone, and then it goes up to 15, all right? And then the alpha goes up to like 12 or so, or I'm sorry, 17. And then again, you could see with the second pound of hops, it drops down to almost 25 ppm of ISO. And the other thing that's kind of neat here is as you start adding another pound and another pound and another pound of hops, you do start to lose some ISO, but it's not a lot. All right. And so one of the things we learned from these experiments is the higher the IBU, the bigger the loss. Okay. With that initial first 2 pounds. Okay.
Okay.
And then after that, you don't lose that much. And it's primarily because once you get to around 25, 20 ppm of isoalpha acid, isoalpha acid is very soluble at that concentration. So the leaf material isn't going to be like absorbing and removing it like it is at the higher concentrations. And this is one of the things I like to point out is that a lot of people don't appreciate that isoalpha acids are not really soluble in beer at these really high concentrations. So it doesn't take a lot to want to remove it from the beer. And this is why when you add a pound of hop pellets to a very high IBU beer, it'll remove a significant amount. This is kind of a side note, but I gave this talk many years ago, and I ran into this fellow about a year later who saw my talk, and he said, "Hey, I wanted to let you know." He goes, "I was visiting a craft brewer after I saw your talk on dry hopping, and he was very upset because the brewmaster ended up adding twice as much hops to the kettle than he was supposed to. So the beer was over the top bitter. He hated to think that he had to dump it, but he didn't know what to do. And he said, "Hey, I just saw this talk. Dry hop your beer and it'll remove the ISO." And that's exactly what they ended up doing. And it saved the beer. They were able to make an IPA and the beer became drinkable.
It worked.
So it worked. Yeah, so it worked. But so as you can see here, though, because the humulinones, again, are so soluble, after even 6 pounds, look at this, you're up around, 50, almost 50 ppm of humulinone in the beer. Okay. So this next slide here, again, is the same beers that we have on the left. But what we did here is we ran the IBU on those beers, and then we did the calculated bitterness using the HPLC data. Okay. Right. And as you can see here, after, again, there's a big disconnect. When you do that 1 pound of dry hopping, okay, it makes the beer less bitter. Okay. With the second pound, the bitterness starts to kind of come up. All right. Right. And then finally, when you get to about maybe the third pound and the fourth pound, it's getting to the bitterness level of what the beer was before you started dry hopping. But if you look at the blue line, this is the IBU line. You're like, wait a second, these IBUs are like almost twice as much, all right, as what the perceived bitterness is. And this is what I always tell people: if you're dry hopping with like 1 to 2 pounds per barrel or more, whatever the IBU is, the perceived bitterness is probably a little bit more than half of what the IBU suggests.
Mhm.
And again, this is because when you do that IBU test, you're extracting not only the isoalpha acids, but you're also extracting the humulinones and the alpha acids. And like I said, if you're dry hopping a high IBU beer, with a lot of hops, you'll also be removing a lot of your isoalpha acids, which are the primary bittering compound in the beer.
Right. And there is a few points that I want to, stay at this slide a little longer and discuss with you. So I want to start with the graph on the left first. Dr. Jean Paul, how did you identify that the isoalpha acid is absorbed by the hop matters?
Yeah. So what we did after we did our dry hopping, we actually isolated the spent hop material from the beer, right? After we dry hopped it, we isolated it. And then we extracted it with ethanol and then concentrated the ethanol down and then injected it onto the HPLC. And we absolutely saw the isoalpha acids, from that ethanol extract.
Wow.
Yeah. I should know, it's kind of interesting, different countries dry hop at different levels.
Yes.
And I've gone to conferences in Europe, and often, because dry hopping is now popular everywhere around the world, I'll often have people give talks, and I'll go to these talks in Europe, and they'll say like, well, it's been reported that when you dry hop, you lose isoalpha acid, but we didn't see any of that happening, right?
Yeah.
And I'd be like, yeah, it's because you're dry hopping with like 1/10 of a pound per barrel, and we kind of made that point, I think, pretty clear in our publications, is if you're at a 1/2 pound per barrel dry hopping, you're not going to have a real big material change in your, let's say, hop acid composition of the beer.
Yeah.
If you're using even less, you're going to have no change,
Right.
So again, this is for if you're dry hopping a pretty bitter beer and you're using, 1 pound per barrel or more,
Right.
And so like the first time that I heard that the hop leaf matters kind of like stripped the isoalpha acid, to some extent. Depends on the initial concentration of the dry hop load that you add. But, this is kind of a discovery that's like, wow, what an amazing point of this research. And probably the second point is for the calculated bitterness from the HPLC versus the spectro UV method, the IBU, in the right graph. What I want to discuss with you here is, let's say we are at the 4 pound per barrel dry hop, right? I would say that the spectral value kind of meets with the calculated value. So if at this point we purely use just isoalpha acid to make a beer with 45 ppm of bitterness, and it is verified by the HPLC, and then we compare it with the beer in this graph with 4 pound per barrel of dry hop, the perceived bitterness from the dry hopped one is supposed to be mellower, right?
Well, yes and no, I guess. In theory, if you made a beer with just those hop acids, okay, I think it would. It would. But when you are dry hopping, you're adding so much essential oils to the beer and other compounds from the hop that it would be a hard one to compare the bitterness profile, let's say, of a dry hop beer. But we've done that where, like I said, we've made, I call it kind of like a synthetic beer, because we could add, we make isoalpha acid at the plant, we make the humulinone in the lab, and then we could also, isolate the alpha acid from the plant or in the lab. And so we can add those pure compounds to let's say, unhopped beer and compare it. But if you're actually dry hopping, it would be probably hard to compare the two. But you're right. A synthetic beer, let's say, you would taste the two and you would say, this one's a lot smoother and whatnot. Yeah.
All right. Cool.
One of the other things I would I was going to say one of the other things I should mention with regard to these slides is I sometimes tell people like, so if you're going to brew an IPA, you might want to just shoot for an IBU of 25, all right, before you dry hop.
Okay.
That way you don't lose a lot of your ISO.
Okay. Got it. Oh, yeah, this is kind of awesome. And, we've came a long way, from the lupulin glands to the HPLC and then to your research. Dr. John Paul, like, do you have any final says for this beloved and near and dear to your heart topic?
I don't think so. I mean, like I said, I think if the people read the publication that I wrote, the one I sent you, it's probably the best version of all the research all put together. And so,
go check it out.
Yeah, check it out.
Go check it out, right? All right. Dr. John Paul, I mean, thank you so much for joining us today. It has been a pleasure to have you on.
And this topic is truly fascinating.
Yeah.
No, yeah, it's been my pleasure. I'm happy to do it. I was going to say, when we finally got most of this research dialed in and done, I was asked to give a presentation to lots of these small local conferences, brewing conferences, and I would often go up to some of the craft brewers and I would say, "So, do you know what a humulinone is?" And the guy's looking at me like, "What are you talking about?" And I was like, "Oh, no, you're going to learn a lot today." And then after my talk, I said, "Did you learn anything?" He's like, "Oh my God."
Too many, right?
I was going to say, I'm not sure if you're aware, I had a publication that came out, I think it was a year or two ago. It was on the discovery of a new alpha acid and beta acid. Have you seen that one?
Yeah, I've seen that one.
That was a really fun project.
And super nice one too. I mean, I've seen that one. I've listened to the podcast that you went on.
Yeah.
And also there's another presentation that you gave about the hidden secret of New England IPA.
Oh, right. Yeah.
That one also tells a lot of things, especially the beta acid that you mentioned.
With the presence of the, I'm not sure, am I going to pronounce this right? The xanthohumol, right?
Oh, xanthohumol, yeah. That was also very high. Yeah. Yeah, it was kind of interesting because we had just literally finished all this work on what I call West Coast style IPAs, right? Which we were just talking about.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, and I'm from Connecticut originally, right? And I started hearing about New England IPAs and I was like, what are they talking about? I was just up in Connecticut. I'd never heard of this before. So fortunately, one of the chemists in our lab, I asked him about, we should do this project to see how different they are from West Coast style IPAs. Because they go, I know they were hazy but I mean, anyways, but fortunately we were able to get 12 breweries and, craft breweries in New England. And we told them we want to do this study. So as soon as the beer is packaged, send it to us. All right. Because we wanted to get it fresh. Because we, as you know, from that publication, we did a huge number of tests on the beer. And in any event, it was shocking to see that haze actually had a property. It actually solubilized a lot of these nonpolar compounds or less soluble compounds. In fact, it's kind of funny because these hazy IPAs have a reputation of having very poor shelf life. Okay. And I would always say in my talk, but given the very high concentration of xanthohumol, I go, these beers should have the best shelf life. Okay. Because xanthohumol is a excellent hydroxy radical scavenger. And hydroxy radicals are what's responsible for beer oxidation. So if you have something that can prevent that from happening, it should be more stable. I think what ended up happening is that a lot of these craft brewers, for whatever reason, all these hazies are packaged in cans. Okay. And can packaging could be some of the worst packaging you can do. And especially if you're using these mobile canning lines, they're just like the kiss of death. And so I would often say, if you can get your DO, your dissolved oxygen level below 50 parts per billion, when you package, I go, these beers should, I would think, have a much better shelf life. And anyways, it was funny, about a year later, a guy came up to me and he says, I saw your talk on the hazy. He goes, we made changes. And he goes, and it's now our most stable beer. And I was like, oh, wow, awesome. I go, what did you do? He goes, I can't tell you. But
Oh,
I'm
yeah.
assuming he just got his packaging dialed in.
Right.
I think
That should be part of it, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
That should be part of it.
That's great. That's awesome. That's awesome. All right, cool. I guess I have to let you go now, but yeah, I truly appreciate what you have shown and guided us through this session, and thanks a lot for your time.
Love it, John Paul.
Hey, you're welcome. My pleasure. All right. Nice meeting you.
Yeah. All right, cool. Nice meeting you. All right, cool. Take care. Goodbye.
Bye.